How often do people in high-rise apartments see their neighbors naked? Not enough for some, too much for others. High-rise living can feel like being a part of a soap opera you never auditioned for. For some, the idea of catching a glimpse of a neighbor in the buff is a tantalizing prospect that never seems to materialize. It's like the universe has an ironic sense of humor, carefully orchestrating life so that the people most eager for a free show are left wanting, while those who dread the very thought of seeing their neighbors bare behind can't seem to escape it. Every time you glance out the window, it's like a cosmic roulette. Will today be the day? Probably not, but for someone on the other side of town, the jackpot just hit, and they're getting an eyeful they never asked for. It's funny, really. For those who yearn to catch a peek, the idea of it happening is almost romanticized. You imagine a perfectly toned person walking casually across their living room, unaware of the accidental intimacy they're sharing. But in reality, it's usually far less glamorous. When you finally do see something, it's not always what you were hoping for. Maybe an elderly man scratching his belly in a pair of sagging briefs, or someone dancing naked to their heart's content, oblivious to the fact that they have an audience. It's not quite the highlight of your day, but hey, it makes for a great story at dinner parties. For others, the daily horror of accidentally glancing at their naked neighbors becomes an unfortunate part of urban life. The ones who dread it can't escape it, while the ones who seek it out are always left chasing that elusive glimpse, like some weird urban myth that never quite pans out. Curtains, the unsung heroes of high-rise living. There's a certain romanticism to the idea of leaving your curtains wide open in a high-rise. You imagine all the sunlight streaming in, the skyline sparkling in the distance, and you, basking in the glory of a space filled with natural light. It's the picture-perfect urban dream, until, of course, you forget that open windows mean open views, and that someone across the way might be getting more than just a scenic look at the city. You go about your day, sipping coffee, reading, maybe even walking around in your bathrobe, blissfully unaware that you're the star of someone else's accidental show. Of course, most of the time, it's innocent enough. Maybe you forget to close the blinds before heading to the shower, and on your way to grab a towel, you realize too late that the neighbors across the street just got a full frontal view. It's not intentional, just one of those moments where your brain takes a break, and you're left standing there, wondering how to play it off. Do you act casual, as though this is a perfectly normal part of your routine? Or do you scramble to close the curtains, hoping they'll think it was all just a fleeting accident? Either way, the damage is done, and you know that somewhere, someone is probably chuckling at the show they just witnessed. Privacy film is a game changer for those of us prone to forgetfulness. It's the hero we didn't know we needed, turning our apartments into light-filled sanctuaries without the risk of flashing the entire neighborhood. And let's be real, who wouldn't want to live in a space that feels like it's constantly bathed in rainbows? You get to keep your morning routine, naked coffee sipping and all, without worrying that you're becoming the unwitting star of someone's morning routine across the way. It's a small investment for peace of mind and a touch of whimsy in an otherwise ordinary day. Prism film, the magical answer. If you've ever had the pleasure of installing Prism film in your apartment, you know it's like stepping into a living dream. It's not just about privacy, although that's a huge perk. It's about transforming your space into something magical. Imagine waking up each morning to your living room bathed in rainbows, light refracting off the walls in a way that makes you feel like you're living inside a kaleidoscope. The best part? You get all the beauty of natural light without any of the anxiety that comes with knowing your neighbors might be watching you scramble around in your pajamas, or worse. The opaque privacy film in the bedroom is practical, sure, but the Prism film? That's pure joy. Every time the sun hits it just right, your apartment becomes a canvas for light, and it's like you've created your own personal art installation. You're not just blocking out prying eyes. You're embracing the beauty of the world outside while keeping your private moments exactly that, private. And honestly, who wouldn't want to live in a rainbow-filled world? It's like turning your home into a sanctuary of peace and color, where you can dance around in your living room without a care in the world, knowing that even if someone is looking, all they're going to see is a light show. The elusive Goldilocks zone. You've heard of the Goldilocks zone in space, right? That perfect distance from a star where conditions are just right for life? Well, in high-rise living, there's something I like to call the Goldilocks zone, where you see just the right amount of naked neighbors. Not too many, not too few, just the perfect balance where your mornings are occasionally spiced up by a fleeting glimpse of someone across the way, but not so much that you're constantly feeling like you live in a weird version of the Truman Show. It's a delicate balance, really. Too few naked sightings, and you start to feel like you're missing out on some unspoken perk of high-rise living. Too many, and suddenly you're wishing for a little less transparency in your neighbors' lives. But when you hit that sweet spot, it's like you're living in a world of accidental intrigue. One morning, you might catch a glimpse of someone doing yoga in their birthday suit, and the next day, it's back to business as usual. It keeps things interesting without overwhelming you with the constant parade of humanity in all its raw, unfiltered glory. There's a strange satisfaction in knowing you've found the perfect high-rise balance. You get just enough of the unexpected to keep life from becoming too predictable, but not so much that you start feeling like you need to keep your blinds permanently closed to avoid the barrage of nakedness. It's the kind of thing you can brag about at dinner parties, the fact that you live in the Goldilocks zone, where life is just weird enough to be interesting, but not so weird that you start questioning your choice of neighborhood. Hotel windows, a world of their own. Hotels are a special kind of strange when it comes to privacy, or the lack of it. There's something about checking into a hotel room that seems to make people forget that the world outside their windows still exists. Maybe it's the temporary nature of it all, the idea that you're just passing through, so what does it matter if someone across the street catches a glimpse of you in your underwear, or less? Or maybe it's the feeling of being in a new city, where the normal rules don't apply, and you're free to live your life like a movie star who doesn't care who's watching. Of course, the reality is that hotel windows are often in full view of the surrounding buildings, and the people who live and work in those buildings are treated to some interesting sights. Whether it's someone fresh out of the shower, blissfully unaware that they're putting on a show, or a couple who forgot to close the curtains during a particularly intimate moment, hotel windows seem to invite a level of vulnerability that most people wouldn't dare show at home. It's like the hotel window becomes a stage, and the world outside is the audience, whether the performer realizes it or not. For those lucky enough to be on the audience side of things, hotel windows provide a never-ending source of unexpected entertainment. One day, you're minding your own business, and the next, you're treated to a full-on display of human nature in its rawest form. It's not always pretty, and it's rarely something you want to see more than once, but it's undeniably fascinating. It's the kind of thing you don't talk about, but it lingers in the back of your mind every time you glance out the window. You never know what you're going to see, and that's half the fun of it. Seattle, the city that forgot curtains. Ah, Seattle. The land of rain, coffee, and apparently, forgotten curtains. There's a certain laid-back attitude that seems to permeate the city, and it extends to the windows of its high-rise apartments. Maybe it's the constant overcast skies that make people forget they're living in a glass box, or maybe it's just the Seattle way of saying, hey, we're all in this together. Whatever the reason, it's not uncommon to walk through the city and catch a glimpse of someone going about their daily life with the curtains wide open. And it's not just casual glimpses, either. It's full-on windows into people's lives, where you can see everything from someone making breakfast in the nude to a person sprawled out on their couch, blissfully unaware that they're part of the city's skyline. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if curtains are an optional feature in Seattle apartments or if the city just collectively decided to embrace transparency in all aspects of life. Either way, it's an unspoken agreement. You don't look too long, and they pretend not to notice that you saw. For those living in the surrounding high-rises, it's just part of the scenery. You go about your day, glancing out the window now and then, and sometimes you're treated to a show. It's not intentional, most of the time, but it's a reminder that in a city filled with glass, privacy is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. And honestly, after a while, you stop being surprised by it. It becomes just another part of urban life, like the sound of traffic or the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. You see it, you move on, and maybe you chuckle to yourself at the thought that somewhere, someone is probably watching you, too. The "I don't care" attitude. Then there are the bold ones. The people who just don't care who sees them naked. They've long since made peace with the fact that their neighbors might catch a glimpse of them in all their glory, and honestly, they couldn't be bothered to close the curtains. Maybe it's confidence, maybe it's apathy, or maybe they just forgot. Either way, they've embraced the idea that life is too short to worry about who might be watching. They stroll through their apartments like it's no big deal, and for them, it isn't. It's funny, though. The older you get, the less you care about things like that. You start to realize that everyone has a body, and everyone has seen a naked person before. What's the big deal? You're in your own home, doing your own thing, and if someone happens to glance through the window, well, that's on them. It's not like you're putting on a show, you're just living your life, and if someone happens to catch a glimpse, so be it. And it's not just about age. For some, it's about embracing their own comfort and not letting societal expectations dictate how they live. They've reached a point where they're comfortable in their own skin, literally, and they're not going to let a little thing like a window get in the way of that. If anything, they see it as a form of self-expression, a way to say, this is me, take it or leave it. It's freeing, in a way, to live without fear of judgment, and for those who can do it, it's a testament to self-acceptance. The boldness of naked confidence. What's fascinating about living in a high-rise is how certain neighbors just own it. There's this guy across the street, let's call him Greg. Every morning at 7:15 sharp, like clockwork, Greg steps out of his shower, towel slung over his shoulder, completely at ease with the world. He's the embodiment of a man who has accepted that his life is visible to whoever cares to look, and he's completely unbothered by it. And the thing is, Greg isn't some Greek god carved from marble, he's just a regular guy, probably in his mid-40s, with a bit of a dad bod and a receding hairline. But the way he strides confidently through his apartment, you'd think he was posing for an art exhibit. There's something kind of inspiring about it, honestly. Greg has reached a level of self-acceptance that many of us only dream of. He's living his best life, and if the rest of the neighborhood happens to see it, well, that's just part of the deal. He's probably got a philosophy along the lines of, if you're looking, that's your problem, not mine. And in a weird way, he's right. It makes you wonder, how would the world be different if we all had a little more of Greg's I don't care attitude? Would we be more relaxed, more self-assured? Maybe we'd all be walking around in our birthday suits, metaphorically and literally, without a second thought. After all, we spend so much time worrying about what other people think, but Greg? Greg is out here teaching us that it's all just noise. And he's doing it with nothing but a towel slung casually over one shoulder. The incident, a high-rise horror story. Not all naked neighbor stories are amusing or inspiring. Sometimes, they fall squarely into the category of things you wish you could unsee. There was this one time, late at night, when I looked out my window and, for the briefest moment, thought I was witnessing a murder. There, across the way, illuminated by the faint glow of a bedside lamp, was a person lying on the bed, completely motionless, while another figure stood over them. My heart jumped into my throat. I thought about calling the police, but something made me hesitate. I squinted, trying to make sense of the scene, when suddenly, the standing figure's arm plunged down, and then up again. My mind was racing. Was I witnessing a crime? But then it happened again. And again. And then, with horror, I realized what I was actually looking at, a man with his entire fist inside another person. This wasn't a crime scene, it was something far more intimate and yet, somehow even more unsettling. I quickly closed my blinds, but the image was burned into my brain. I've seen a lot of things living in a high-rise, but nothing quite like that. To this day, I can't look at that building without thinking of that night. It's a reminder that you never know what's happening behind closed doors, or, in this case, open windows. High-rise living is full of surprises, but some surprises you'd rather live without. I don't know who they were, and frankly, I don't want to know. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. But every now and then, when I catch a glimpse of that building, I wonder if they ever got some blinds. I sure hope so, for their sake and mine. The art of the accidental exhibitionist. You'd think that after all these years of living in a high-rise, would have mastered the art of pulling the curtains. But no. There I was, fresh out of the shower, towel around my waist, when I remembered I left my phone on the kitchen counter. Without thinking, I walked straight through the living room, across the big, wide-open windows, and into the kitchen. It wasn't until I grabbed my phone that it hit me. I had just paraded myself in front of the entire block. The worst part? There was construction going on in the building across the street. If any of those workers happened to glance my way, they got more of a show than they bargained for. For a moment, I considered pulling the blinds down and pretending it never happened. But then I thought, why bother? The damage is already done. Instead, I decided to lean into it. I strolled back across the living room with all the confidence I could muster, hoping that if anyone was watching, they'd at least be impressed by my nonchalance. It was one of those moments where you just have to laugh at yourself. After all, what's done is done. If anyone's telling stories about their naked neighbor, I might as well give them something worth talking about. Naked handstands and binoculars. One of the most bizarre sights I've ever seen was a woman who liked to do naked handstands in front of her window. I'm not even kidding. Every few weeks, like clockwork, she'd strip down, stretch a bit, and then flip upside down in a perfect handstand, completely exposed to anyone with a view. It was mesmerizing in a, "this is so weird I can't look away," kind of way. And let's be honest, how often do you see someone practicing yoga in the nude? It's like she was performing for an audience she couldn't see, but knew was there. A living room Cirque du Soleil, minus the costumes. The best part, though, was that she didn't seem to care at all. There she was, upside down, completely naked, as calm and composed as if she were doing a headstand at the local gym. It got to the point where I started leaving a pair of binoculars by the window, not because I was being creepy, well, maybe a little, but because I couldn't believe my eyes. I had to know if this was real or just some weird trick of the light. Turns out, it was very real, and I wasn't the only one who had noticed. My friends would come over, and we'd all sit around waiting to see if today would be a handstand day. But the naked handstands weren't the only show in town. There was also a lesbian couple in the building who never closed their curtains, and every time they got intimate, it was like watching an episode of the L Word unfold across the street. They weren't shy about it either. Their bedroom was fully visible, and they made no effort to hide what was going on. It became a bit of a neighborhood spectacle, with people casually mentioning the couple in passing conversations. We all knew who they were, and while it was a little awkward, it was also kind of fascinating. I guess that's just high-rise living for you. One part voyeurism, one part unexpected entertainment. Binoculars and boundaries. Speaking of binoculars, there's something about living in a high-rise that makes you rethink your boundaries. You'd think that living several stories above the ground would give you all the privacy you need, but the truth is, your windows are like movie screens, and anyone with a decent view can see right in. Of course, most of us don't spend our time peering into our neighbors' lives, or at least we won't admit to it, but every now and then, you catch something out of the corner of your eye, a movement, a flash of skin, a quick glimpse of a life that's not your own. One of my neighbors across the way, let's call him Bob, seemed to have no concept of privacy at all. Every morning, he'd walk around his apartment completely naked, shades wide open, like he was starring in his own private reality show. And maybe he was. Bob didn't seem to mind that anyone with a window could see him. He'd make his coffee, answer emails, and even do a little morning stretch, all while letting it all hang out. It got to the point where I started keeping a pair of binoculars by the window, not because I was trying to watch Bob, but because if he was going to put on a show, I figured I might as well get a front row seat. But here's the thing. Bob wasn't trying to be exhibitionist. He was just living his life. There was a kind of innocence to it, a sense that he simply didn't care what the world thought. He wasn't putting on a performance, he was just being Bob. And after a while, I stopped feeling weird about it. In fact, I started to admire his confidence. There was something freeing about it, like he was giving the rest of us permission to just be. So now, when I glance out the window and see Bob going about his day in the buff, I don't turn away. I just smile and think, good for you, Bob. Live your best life. The naked truth about Bob. Eventually, Bob became a bit of a legend in my building. People would mention him casually in conversation, like, "Did you see Bob this morning?" Or, "He was doing yoga again, wasn't he?" It was kind of funny how we all became invested in his routine, even though most of us had never actually met the guy. It's strange how living in such close quarters, yet so far apart, can turn someone into a character in your own personal soap opera. And in a way, Bob was the star of ours. One day, I was having drinks with a neighbor who lives 2 floors down, and she admitted something hilarious. Apparently, she'd been trying to get Bob's attention for weeks. She thought his carefree attitude was charming, and she wanted to know if he was as cool in person as he seemed through the window. The kicker? She'd been walking around her apartment in a series of increasingly ridiculous outfits. One day a fluffy robe, the next a sequin dress, hoping that Bob would notice. But, of course, Bob was oblivious. He was too busy living his naked, zen life to notice the woman 2 floors below putting on her own show. We joked about it for the rest of the night, and I suggested she try one more stunt, walking around her apartment naked. After all, it seemed to work for Bob. The legendary gigapixel incident. And then there was the infamous gigapixel guy. You know, that one viral internet moment that shook the online world for about 5 minutes before it got buried by cat memes and TikTok dances. Some guy pointed a telescopic camera out of his high-rise window and zoomed in on another building. What started as an innocent video of high-rise life took a turn for the bizarre when he zoomed all the way in, right into the middle of a scene that even HBO would shy away from. There, in full clarity, was a man fisting another person. And when I say fisting, I mean past the wrist, no exaggeration. The internet went wild, and it became a legendary clip shared in dark corners of Reddit. Sadly, I haven't been able to find that video since. Part of me wonders if it was taken down or just lost to the ever-expanding digital abyss. Either way, it became the stuff of urban legend. It was proof that yes, high-rise living does have its share of truly wild moments, but you have to be looking at just the right time. The construction workers show. While we're on the subject of high-rise nudity, I have to mention the ongoing saga of my construction worker audience. You see, there's a condo going up across the street, and for the past few months, the workers there have had a front-row view of my apartment. At first, I was self-conscious. I mean, who wouldn't be? But after a while, I figured, why not give them a reason to whistle? So, after my morning showers, I'd walk around in a towel or occasionally just let the towel accidentally slip. To my surprise, no whistles. No catcalls. Nothing. It was actually kind of disappointing. I'm not sure what that says about me, but a little part of me was hoping for some acknowledgement. Maybe construction workers aren't as easy to impress as I thought. But one day, after weeks of silence, I finally got what I was waiting for. I stepped out of the shower, towel loosely wrapped around my waist, and one of the workers looked right at me, gave me a slow, exaggerated thumbs up, and went back to his job. That was it. The validation I didn't know I needed. I laughed to myself, closed the curtains, and went about my day. At least now I know someone's watching, even if they're not whistling. The binocular masterclass. I wasn't the only one with a view, of course. The building across from mine had its fair share of characters, and one of the most infamous was a guy I called Telescope Tony. Tony had a fancy telescope mounted on a tripod in his living room, and while it looked like something a stargazer might use, I knew better. I'd see Tony adjusting the angle of his telescope, carefully aligning it, not with the night sky, but with the neighboring high-rises. I'm not saying Tony was a full-blown peeping Tom, but let's just say he was very interested in what was happening in other people's apartments. One evening, I saw him point the telescope directly at the apartment of the naked yoga lady, yes, another neighborhood legend. She was, as usual, stretching in front of her window, and Tony was glued to his telescope. It was like watching a sitcom play out in real life. There was something oddly entertaining about the whole thing. 2 people living their best lives, blissfully unaware that they had become part of my evening entertainment. Tony wasn't subtle about his voyeurism, though. One time, while adjusting his telescope, he knocked over a lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise startled him so much that he accidentally tipped the telescope, which swung wildly to the side and smacked right into his window. I burst out laughing from across the street, and for a moment, I thought he might have seen me. But no, Tony was too busy fixing his telescope, determined to catch the last few minutes of the yoga session. It was the kind of awkward, unscripted moment that made high-rise living feel like an endless comedy show. The Naked Neighbor's Handbook. I've lived in enough high-rises to know that there should really be a handbook for this kind of stuff. Rule number 1. If you're going to be naked in front of your window, at least be aware of your audience. Rule number 2. Close your curtains if you don't want to become the talk of the building. And rule number 3. If you have a telescope pointed at your neighbors, maybe, just maybe, reconsider your life choices. But let's be real, the unscripted moments are what make high-rise life so memorable. Like the time I saw a guy eating breakfast naked in his kitchen, only to realize too late that his window was wide open and half the block could see him. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, staring out into the abyss as if contemplating his entire existence. I watched as he calmly put the spoon down, stood up, and closed the curtains with a sigh. We've all been there, buddy. The tale of the umbrella lady, and then there's the naked cyclist incident. I swear, this was one of the strangest things I've ever witnessed. I live in a bungalow near the seafront, and one morning, as I was enjoying a leisurely walk, a middle-aged man rode past on a bicycle, completely naked. I thought maybe I was still dreaming, but no, this was real life. And to make things even stranger, he was being chased by a woman with an umbrella, who was yelling something I couldn't quite make out. It was like a scene out of a Monty Python sketch. The man pedaled furiously, and the woman ran after him, umbrella flailing in the wind. I have no idea what led to that moment, but it was one of those absurd scenes that make you question reality. The next day, I decided to take an early morning walk through the park, thinking nothing could top the naked cyclist. But as I cut across the park, I glanced into a nearby bungalow's kitchen window and locked eyes with an elderly man who was, you guessed it, completely naked. We stared at each other for a brief, awkward moment before I quickly looked away and pretended like it hadn't happened. I couldn't help but laugh to myself as I continued my walk. 2 days in a row, and I'd had more encounters with naked strangers than I cared to admit. Maybe I should stay indoors tomorrow. The Empire State Surprise. Speaking of accidental nudity, have you ever heard about the Empire State Building gigapixel image? It was part of a promotional project, capturing the entire city in stunning detail. But leave it to Reddit to find something unexpected. Someone zoomed in on one of the windows in a nearby building, and lo and behold, there was a naked man, casually going about his day, completely unaware that he had been immortalized in a massive, citywide image. It didn't take long for Reddit to spread the word, and soon enough, everyone was trying to find the infamous naked man. It became a game of Where's Waldo, except with fewer stripes and a lot more skin. A spy among us. One of the funniest encounters I ever had involved my neighbor, who we'll call Pete. Pete was a good guy, friendly, polite, and always willing to lend a hand if you needed one. But Pete had one fatal flaw. He was absolutely terrible at hiding the fact that he was spying on people. You see, Pete had a thing for his neighbor across the street, a woman who had a habit of leaving her blinds open just a little too often. One day, I caught Pete with his binoculars, perched on his windowsill like some sort of suburban spy. When I asked him what he was doing, he stammered for a moment before admitting, "I'm just birdwatching." I raised an eyebrow. In the middle of the city? He nodded, clearly flustered. You'd be surprised how many pigeons live around here. From that day on, we referred to Pete as the birdwatcher, even though we all knew what he was really up to. But the funniest part? The woman across the street had no idea she was the star of Pete's not-so-secret birdwatching hobby. Eventually, Pete gave up his spying antics, mostly because his binoculars fell out of the window one day and landed in the street below. If that's not karma, I don't know what is. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment and follow for more stories.